In the kitchens of Daly City in the early 1970s, the air smelled different from the rest of the Bay Area. It smelled like vinegar and garlic hitting hot oil at 6 in the morning. It smelled like patties, the fish sauce that neighbors 3 doors down could identify with their eyes closed. Filipino families had been settling along the California coast since the 1920s, and by the 70s, entire blocks in Daly City, Stockton, and around Temple Street in Los Angeles had become the kitchens of a displaced nation. Number 16 on this list made American dinner guests leave the table. Number 9 on this list showed up at every gathering, whether it was a birthday, a funeral, or a Tuesday. And number 20 required an ingredient most California grocery stores refused to stock. These were not exotic recipes from a foreign country. They were the way an entire generation kept the Philippines alive on American soil. Hit that subscribe button, because here are 25 dishes Filipino immigrants cooked in 1970s California. Number 25. Tortang talong. The eggplant was charred directly over the gas burner until the skin blistered and peeled away in black ribbons. Filipino mothers in Stockton did this every morning with the same calm as brushing their hair. They mashed the soft flesh with a fork, dipped the whole thing in beaten egg, and fried it flat in a shallow pool of oil until the edges turned golden and crisp. In the Philippines, tortang talong was a leftover solution. In California, it became a weeknight staple because eggplants grew in backyard gardens from San Jose to San Diego and cost almost nothing at the Asian markets along International Boulevard. Some families added ground pork mixed into the egg batter. Others kept it plain and ate it with a mound of steamed rice and a puddle of banana ketchup. If you grew up eating eggs shaped like a flattened purple fan, you did not need anyone to explain what this was. Number 24. Ginisang ampalaya. Bitter melon was one of those vegetables that divided a household in half. The children hated it. The parents ate it like medicine they actually enjoyed. In Filipino kitchens across the Central Valley, ampalaya was sliced thin, salted, and squeezed dry to pull some of the bitterness out before it hit the pan. Then it was sautéed with garlic, onion, tomato, and scrambled egg, the bitterness cutting through the richness in a way that made the whole plate feel balanced. Older Filipinos believed it cleaned the blood and lowered sugar, and they ate it with the conviction of people who had watched their own grandparents live past 90 on the same diet. In the Sacramento Valley, where Filipino farm workers had been tending asparagus fields since the 1930s, ampalaya grew easily in the same soil. That vine climbed anything vertical and produced more fruit than a single family could eat. Number 23. Lugaw. Rice porridge, the simplest thing a Filipino kitchen could produce, and the first thing that appeared when someone was sick, cold, or too tired to chew. 1 cup of rice cooked in 8 cups of water with ginger and a little fish sauce until the grains dissolved into a thick, starchy soup. In Filipino households in Daly City and Vallejo, lugaw was breakfast on rainy mornings and dinner when money was short. Some families stirred in a raw egg at the end and let the heat cook it into pale ribbons. Others topped it with fried garlic chips and a squeeze of calamansi, the small Filipino citrus that grew in pots on apartment balconies all over the Bay Area. Lugaw required almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and fed anyone who needed feeding. That was the whole point. Number 22. Ukoy. These were shrimp fritters, but calling them fritters misses what they actually looked like. A handful of tiny shrimp, sometimes with the shells still on, mixed into a batter of rice flour, water, and sliced sweet potato, then dropped into hot oil where they spread into flat, lacy discs with the shrimp legs poking out at odd angles. Filipino families in Carson and Long Beach made ukoy on weekends, especially when the small shrimp were cheap at the fish markets along the harbor. The crunch was the thing. Every bite shattered between your teeth with that particular sound that frying gives to rice flour, lighter and sharper than wheat. In the Visayas region of the Philippines, ukoy was street food sold in paper bags. In California, it was a Saturday afternoon project that turned the kitchen into a cloud of oil smoke and made the entire house smell like the ocean. Number 21. Pinakbet. This was the vegetable stew that Ilocano families in California treated as a point of regional pride. It required a very specific combination: bitter melon, eggplant, okra, squash, tomato, and string beans, all cut into large pieces and layered in a clay pot with bagoong, the fermented shrimp paste that gave the whole dish its deep, salty backbone. Ilocanos, who had settled in the Salinas Valley and around Stockton in the 1930s and 1940s, grew most of these vegetables themselves. By the 1970s, their children were making pinakbet with produce from the same gardens their parents had planted decades earlier. The stew was not stirred. The vegetables were layered from hardest to softest and left to steam in their own liquid, collapsing slowly into each other until the pot held something between a stew and a sauce. Other Filipino groups had their own vegetable dishes, but pinakbet belonged to the Ilocanos, and they made sure you knew it. Number 20. Kare-kare. The smell came first. Peanuts roasting in a dry pan, then ground into a paste that thickened a simmering pot of oxtail, tripe, and vegetables into something that resembled a golden stew with the consistency of gravy. In Filipino kitchens across Los Angeles in the early 1970s, kare-kare was the dish that took the longest, cost the most, and earned the most respect at the table. The oxtail had to simmer for hours until the collagen melted and the meat slid off the bone with a nudge from a spoon. The peanut sauce had to be thick enough to coat the back of a ladle. And the bagoong on the side, that fermented shrimp paste, was not optional. Without it, kare-kare was incomplete. With it, the salt and funk of the paste against the sweetness of the peanut sauce created a combination that no American recipe book in 1973 would have understood. The difficulty was sourcing. Oxtail was not a standard cut at Safeway or Lucky in the early 70s. Filipino cooks in historic Filipino town near Temple Street relied on small butcher shops run by other immigrants, Korean and Mexican and Filipino, who kept the cuts that mainstream supermarkets threw away or ground into pet food. Tripe was the same story. The parts of the animal that American culture had decided were waste became the foundation of one of the most complex dishes in Filipino cooking. Kare-kare showed up at fiestas, at birthdays, at baptisms, at every occasion that demanded the host prove they could cook. The women who made it never followed a written recipe. They measured by feel, by color, by the way the sauce moved in the pot. Number 19. Turon. Take a ripe Saba banana, the short, stout cooking banana that Filipino markets in California stocked by the crate. Slice it lengthwise, roll it in brown sugar, wrap it in a lumpia wrapper, and fry it until the sugar caramelizes into a crackling shell. That was turon. It was dessert. It was a snack. It was the thing children ate standing in the kitchen before dinner was ready. Some families added a strip of jackfruit inside the wrapper alongside the banana, the sweetness layering on sweetness in a way that would make a Western pastry chef reconsider everything they knew about restraint. In the 1970s, Saba bananas were not available in regular grocery stores. They came from Asian markets in Daly City or from boxes shipped by relatives in Hawaii, where Filipino plantation workers had been growing them for decades. If you had turon, you had access to the right banana. That quiet detail separated the families who could make it from the ones who could not. Number 18. Champorado. Chocolate rice porridge sounds like something a food magazine would invent to fill a trend piece. Filipino families were making it every morning in 1972. Glutinous rice cooked in water with tablea, the rough discs of pure cacao that came from the Philippines in care packages or from the few stores in Los Angeles that carried them. The result was thick, dark, bittersweet, and eaten with a drizzle of evaporated milk and a side of dried fish. That combination, the sweet chocolate rice against the salty, leathery tuyo, confused every non-Filipino who encountered it. It was not supposed to make sense by Western breakfast logic. It made sense by Filipino breakfast logic, which operated on a principle of contrast that treated sweet and salty not as opposites, but as partners. Children who grew up eating champorado in San Francisco kitchens in the 70s still remember the way the evaporated milk swirled into the dark porridge like clouds in a storm. Number 17. Pochero. This was the Filipino answer to the Spanish cocido, a boiled dinner of beef shanks, potatoes, plantains, cabbage, Chickpeas and tomato sauce simmered until every ingredient had given up its flavor to the pot. Filipino immigrants from the Visayas and Manila brought puchero to California, where it became a weekend meal for families in National City and San Diego. The plantains were the signature. They gave the broth a faint sweetness that separated puchero from any other beef soup in the Filipino kitchen. Some cooks added Chinese sausage, a nod to the Chinese-Filipino trade routes that had shaped Philippine cooking for centuries. Others threw in green beans and bok choy, using whatever the Asian market had on sale that week. Puchero was never flashy. It was a slow, patient pot that rewarded the household with leftovers for 3 days. There is a particular kind of cooking that happens when a people bring their food to a country that does not recognize it. It is not restaurant cooking. It is not performance. It is the cooking of closed kitchens, where the door stays shut and the windows fog over, and the only audience is the family sitting around a table that was not designed for this many people. Filipino immigrants in 1970s California cooked this way because nobody else was going to do it for them. No cookbook in English covered these dishes. No television show mentioned them. The knowledge moved mouth to mouth, mother to daughter, and if it was lost, it was gone. Number 16. Dinuguan, pork blood stew. The name came from dugo, the Tagalog word for blood, and this was the dish that most clearly separated the Filipino kitchen from the American one. Cubed pork shoulder and offal simmered in a thick, dark sauce made from vinegar and fresh pig blood. The taste was earthy, tangy, and deeply savory, and the texture of the sauce was smooth in a way that hid its origin from anyone who did not ask questions. Filipino families in Eagle Rock and historic Filipino town served dinuguan with puto, the steamed rice cakes that offset the richness with their soft, slightly sweet chew. At gatherings, it was the dish that separated the guests. American friends who tried it without being told what it was usually liked it. American friends who were told first usually did not try it at all. Filipino cooks learned quickly which approach worked better. The stew did not care either way. It had been made this way for centuries. Number 15. Bistec Tagalog. Filipino beefsteak was not a steak in the American sense. It was thinly sliced beef, marinated in soy sauce and calamansi juice, pan-fried until the edges darkened, and served buried under a pile of caramelized onion rings. The acid from the calamansi broke down the cheap cuts that Filipino families in Oxnard and Watsonville could afford, turning round steak or chuck into something tender enough to eat with a spoon and rice. The onions were the secret architecture. They were cooked separately, slowly, until they went from raw and sharp to soft and sweet, then layered on top of the beef in a quantity that Americans would call excessive and Filipinos would call correct. Bistec showed up on paydays and at potlucks where the host wanted to prove that Filipino food was not all vinegar and fish sauce. The soy and citrus and caramelized onion hit every part of the palate at once. Number 14. Sinigang na baboy. If there was one dish that every Filipino household in California made regardless of which region they came from, it was sinigang. Pork ribs, sometimes with belly still attached, simmered in a sour broth made from tamarind, tomatoes, onions, and whatever vegetables were in the kitchen. Long green peppers, string beans, radish, water spinach, eggplant. The sourness was the point. Not lemon sour, not vinegar sour, tamarind sour, which had a rounded, fruity tartness that made the back of your jaw tighten and your mouth fill with water before the spoon even reached your lips. In the 1970s, Filipino families in Daly City and Vallejo used tamarind concentrate from small imported cans. When those were unavailable, they boiled dried tamarind pods and strained the pulp through a sieve, a process that took an extra hour but produced a cleaner, brighter sourness that the concentrate could not match. The debate over which souring agent was correct could divide a dinner table along generational and regional lines. Bicolano families used green guava instead. Pampanga households added green mango for a sharper acidity. Every variation was defended with the certainty of a recipe that had been cooked the same way for 4 generations. Sinigang was the comfort food. It was the dish that sick children asked for, that homesick adults craved at midnight. that wedding receptions served alongside the lechon because no celebration was complete without that sour broth cutting through the richness of everything else on the table. The pot was always large. The leftovers were always better the next day, when the sourness deepened and the pork fell apart at the suggestion of a fork. Number 13. Lying. Dried taro leaves cooked in coconut milk with shrimp paste, chili peppers, and pork belly until the coconut reduced into a thick, oily sauce that clung to every leaf. This was Bicolano cooking, the food of the Bicol region in southern Luzon, where coconut palms grew so densely that coconut milk was treated like water. In California, Bicolano families sourced taro leaves from Filipino markets in Union City and Milpitas, or grew them in backyards where the broad, heart-shaped leaves spread across garden beds like green umbrellas. The rule with lying was patience. The pot was never stirred until the very end. Stirring too early broke the leaves and released a chemical irritation from the taro that made the throat itch. You left it alone. You let the coconut do the work. When it was finished, the leaves were soft as cloth and the sauce was rich enough to carry an entire meal. Number 12. Tinola. Chicken pieces simmered in a clear ginger broth with green papaya wedges and chili pepper leaves. The ginger was sliced thick, not grated, and it filled the kitchen with a sharp, clean heat that cleared the sinuses before the first sip. In Filipino households across the San Joaquin Valley, tinola was the soup that appeared when the weather turned cold or when someone had a cough that would not quit. The green papaya was the unusual part for American neighbors. Cut into wedges the size of a thumb, the unripe fruit softened in the broth into something between a potato and a melon, absorbing the ginger and chicken fat until every bite carried the whole flavor of the pot. Tinola was a one-pot meal that needed nothing but a bowl of rice and a quiet evening. Number 11. Paksiw na Bangus. Milkfish cooked in vinegar, garlic, ginger, peppercorns, and a little water until the liquid reduced into a tart, concentrated sauce. Bangus was the national fish of the Philippines, a silvery, oily fish prized for its flavor and cursed for its bones. Filipino families ordered whole milkfish from Asian fish markets in Panorama City and South San Francisco, sometimes frozen, sometimes fresh when the supply lines cooperated. Paksiw was the practical preparation. It preserved the fish in acid, extending its refrigerator life for days, which mattered in households where a single income stretched across 7 or 8 mouths. The vinegar did not make the fish taste pickled. It made it taste clean, almost bright, with the garlic and ginger adding warmth underneath. Some families ate paksiw cold the next morning, straight from the container, the sauce now jellied from the natural gelatin in the fish skin. That was not a compromise. That was a preference, handed down by people who understood that cold paksiw on hot rice was its own category of satisfaction. Number 10. Caldereta. In the Philippines, this was goat stew. In California, it was whatever the cook could find. Beef, usually. Sometimes pork. Rarely goat, because goat was difficult to source in suburban California in the 1970s, unless you knew a rancher or drove to one of the livestock auctions in the Central Valley. The stew itself was Spanish in origin. Meat braised in tomato sauce with potatoes, bell peppers, olives, and liver spread stirred in at the end to thicken and darken the sauce. That liver spread, usually from a can of the same brand that American households used for sandwiches, was the ingredient that made caldereta unmistakable. It gave the sauce a mineral depth and a velvety texture that tomato alone could not produce. In Filipino communities around Stockton and Delano, caldereta was fiesta food. It showed up at town fiestas organized by the community centers that had served as social anchors for a population that American cities had largely overlooked. Number 9. Lumpia Shanghai. If one dish crossed every boundary between Filipino households and American ones, it was lumpia. Small, tightly rolled spring rolls filled with ground pork, minced carrots, onions, garlic, and sometimes water chestnuts, wrapped in a paper-thin wrapper and fried until the outside shattered at the first bite. Every Filipino family gathering in 1970s California had lumpia. Every potluck, every birthday, every holiday party. The production was communal. Women sat around a table with a mountain of wrappers, a bowl of filling, and a small dish of water for sealing the edges, and they rolled 200, 300, sometimes 500 lumpia in a single afternoon. The conversation was the real event. The lumpia was the excuse. Filipino families in Carson, West Covina, and throughout the Inland Empire were known in their neighborhoods as the people who brought lumpia to school events, to church gatherings, to block parties. American children who tasted their first lumpia at a classmate's birthday party in 1974 often spent the next 50 years trying to find one that tasted as good as the first. The wrappers were the challenge. In the Philippines, they were made by hand from a sticky batter spread on a hot griddle. In California, most families bought them frozen from the Asian grocery stores on Mission Boulevard in Daly City or along Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles. The homemade version was thinner, crispier, and infinitely more fragile, and the women who could still make them from scratch were treated with the kind of respect reserved for people who could do something irreplaceable. When the last lumpia disappeared from the plate, and it always did, the party was over. The Filipino community in California in the 1970s was not small, but it was quiet. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos lived in the state by mid-decade, many of them the children and grandchildren of the Manongs, the bachelor farm workers who had arrived in the 1920s and 1930s to tend the fields that fed the rest of the country. Their food was not in any cookbook that American publishers would print. Their restaurants, where they existed, served diner food on the front menu and Filipino dishes only if you knew to ask. The cooking happened at home, and the only people who documented it were the families who ate it. Number 8. Nilaga, boiled beef with corn on the cob, potatoes, and cabbage in a plain, clear broth. There was nothing complicated about nilaga, and that was the whole point. Beef shanks with the bone still in-simmered for an hour or more until the marrow softened and the broth turned rich without any seasoning beyond salt, peppercorns, and a few whole onions. Filipino families in Torrance and Cerritos made nilaga on weekday evenings because it could be assembled in 10 minutes and left on the stove to do its own work. The corn was cut into thick rounds, the cabbage added last so it stayed green and slightly crisp. Some families squeezed calamansi directly into the bowl, the citrus brightening the plain broth into something that tasted deliberate rather than simple. Number 7. Mikado, beef braised in tomato sauce with soy sauce, lemon juice, potatoes, and bay leaves until the meat could be pulled apart with 2 forks. The name came from the Spanish meca, meaning wick, because the original preparation involved threading a strip of pork fat through the center of the beef like a wick through a candle, the fat melting slowly through the meat as it cooked. By the 1970s, most Filipino cooks in California had dropped the larding technique and simply used marbled cuts, but the name stayed. Machado was not fiesta food. It was a Thursday night meal, practical and filling, the kind of dish a mother of 4 in Artesia could put on the stove after work and have ready by the time the children finished homework. The tomato sauce came from a can. The soy sauce came from a bottle. The skill was in knowing the proportions, which nobody wrote down and everybody argued about. Number 6. Bibingka, a rice cake baked in a clay pot lined with banana leaves, the edges caramelized where the batter met the leaf, the center soft and slightly sweet with coconut milk. In the Philippines, bibingka was street food sold outside churches during the Simbang Gabi, the 9-day series of dawn masses leading up to Christmas. In California, Filipino families baked it at home during the holiday season using muffin tins, aluminum pans, and banana leaves sourced from Hawaiian importers or picked from the ornamental banana plants that grew in backyards across Southern California. The traditional toppings were salted duck egg slices and fresh white cheese, a combination of salt and sweet, and the faintly earthy flavor of the banana leaf that had no equivalent in American baking. Churches in Filipino neighborhoods held Christmas bazaars where bibingka sold out before noon, and the line was always longer than the supply. Number 5. Menudo. Filipino menudo was nothing like the Mexican version. Where Mexican menudo was a tripe soup built on dried chilies and hominy, Filipino menudo was a tomato-based stew of cubed pork, liver, potatoes, chickpeas, diced bell peppers, and raisins. The raisins were the detail that confused outsiders. They added a sweetness that cut through the liver and the tomato in a way that made the stew taste layered rather than heavy. Filipino families in Glendale and San Fernando made menudo for parties because it could be scaled up easily and kept warm for hours without falling apart. The liver was the critical ingredient. It was cut into small cubes and added near the end of cooking so it stayed firm rather than turning grainy. Getting that timing right was the kind of skill that took years to learn and seconds to ruin. In some Tagalog households, menudo included hot dogs cut into coins, a post-war addition that reflected decades of American military presence in the Philippines. Number 4. Ginataang kalabasa. Squash simmered in coconut milk with shrimp and string beans until the squash dissolved into the sauce and turned the whole pot golden. The sweetness of the kabocha-style squash against the fat of the coconut and the brine of the shrimp produced a flavor that was simple to describe and impossible to replicate without the right squash. Filipino families in Salinas and Watsonville grew kalabasa in their vegetable gardens alongside bitter melon and eggplant. The vine produced heavy, dense squash with deep orange flesh that held its sweetness through long cooking. American squash varieties from the supermarket were too watery and too bland. The right kalabasa came from Filipino neighbors, Asian grocery stores, or seed packets sent from home. Ginataang kalabasa was a weeknight side dish, not a main course, but it completed the table. Without it, the rice had nowhere sweet to go. Number 3. Pancit bihon. Rice noodles stir-fried with vegetables, soy sauce, and whatever meat was on hand, usually chicken or pork, sometimes both. Pancit was birthday food. In Filipino culture, long noodles meant long life, and every birthday celebration in every Filipino household in California included a pan of pancit large enough to feed every guest and most of the neighbors. The bihon noodles were soaked until pliable, then tossed in a hot wok with shredded cabbage, carrots, celery, green beans, and a sauce made from soy and chicken broth. The noodles absorbed the liquid and the color of everything around them, turning from white to golden brown as the soy darkened them. In Filipino households around Lake Street in Daly City and in Eagle Rock, the pancit pan was the centerpiece of the birthday table, served before the cake. The birthday celebrant ate the first serving to receive the longest life. That tradition traveled from the provinces of Luzon to the suburbs of Los Angeles without losing a single step. Number 2. Chicken and pork adobo. This was the dish that every Filipino cook claimed as their own, and every other Filipino cook said they made better. Chicken pieces and pork belly braised in vinegar, soy sauce, garlic, bay leaves, and whole black peppercorns until the meat was tender and the sauce reduced to a dark, glossy concentrate that coated every surface. The proportions of vinegar to soy defined the cook. Families from Cavite used more vinegar and less soy, producing a tart, almost sharp adobo. Families from Pampanga used more soy and added sugar, making theirs darker and sweeter. Some cooks finished the meat by frying it after braising, creating a crust that shattered against the soft interior. Others served it wet, swimming in sauce, which was the only way if you judged adobo by how much remained for the rice. In 1970s California, Filipino families made adobo the way their specific province made adobo, and deviation was treated not as creativity, but as error. There was no correct version. There were only family versions, each defended with the certainty of people who learned to cook by standing next to their mother and watching her hands. Number 1. Sinangag, garlic fried rice. It was not a dish in the way the other 24 items on this list are dishes. It was the foundation that everything else sat on. Day-old rice broken apart by hand, tossed in a hot pan with an unreasonable amount of minced garlic fried in oil until it turned golden and fragrant and filled the kitchen with a smell that Filipino children in Daly City and Carson and Stockton and National City associated not with cooking but with morning itself. Every dish on this list was eaten with rice. Sinangag was the rice. It was the thing that made the vinegar of adobo work, the sourness of sinigang tolerable, the richness of kare-kare balanced, the plainness of tinola complete. No Filipino meal in 1970s. California happened without it. No kitchen was quiet in the morning until the garlic hit the oil. That sound, that sizzle, that smell drifting through a house where everyone was still half asleep, that was the first language of every Filipino day in California, and it still is. Those 25 dishes were not written in any cookbook that American bookstores carried in the 1970s. They lived in the hands of the women and men who cooked them, in the apartments and tract houses of a community that fed itself without permission or recognition. If you grew up at one of those tables, leave a comment and tell us what your family cooked.